Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to NIA. Kali Chronia, Chronia Pola. Happy New Year to everybody, both for you here in the room and for everybody who's online with us as well. And a special welcome to the students of Helle Hochscheid who were earlier already with us in the Institute. And I'm very happy to see most, if not all of you again here. Thanks very much for coming. We start a third year of TEXNH-Lecture. I can hardly believe it, but we've done, I think, Helle, you're part of the organizational committee. We've done a pretty good job, and I'm very happy today to have Helle here for discussion, and also Dr. David Lewis as a speaker. So I'll start with introducing both of the people that will help us through the evening. David Lewis, our speaker, obtained his PhD in 2012 at the University of Durham and then held a research fellowship in Edinburgh between 13 and 15. This was followed by a second fellowship, an early career Librium fellowship at Edinburgh, which he held until 2016. He was assistant professor of ancient history at the University of Nottingham, so he moved into England for 2 years before he joined the University of Edinburgh Classics Department as a lecturer in 18, where he was next promoted to senior lecturer in August 22. David's research interests include, among many other topics, ancient Greek social, economical, and legal history in the wider East Mediterranean context, so not just Greece, but much wider than that. And many aspects of slavery and the history of labor as well, which is how we got into a common interest. His 2018 monograph is entitled Greek Slave Systems in the East Mediterranean Context from circa 800 to 146 BC. And he has edited many other volumes on topics related to slavery, but also crafting and text as source material. So David's methodologically approach is a method of text mining, at least what we were going to be hearing about today. And he specifically researches occupations in urban and other contexts, Attica and Athens being a very specific field of strong interest. He's also familiar with hundreds of professional jobs as in the ancient Greek world, as we will hear about today, no doubt, whether these were performed full-time or not. And we will hear several details on that in a moment. Then I would also like to introduce Helle. She's not new to us, as she already kicked off that very first TEXNH-Lecture lecture in 2023. And she's assistant professor at the University College Roosevelt, which is part of the University of Utrecht. She obtained her PhD and subsequently published that in a monograph, came out in 2015. More specifically entitled Networks of Stone. Her other research interests, published widely, cover network theory and labor specialization, our common interest, and many more, such as textile production in religious contexts, but also the crossovers between different crafts. For example, the context of stone sculpture, but with the necessary pigment and other decorative elements on the sculpture indicating textile. So we have here two different crafts in one. Since 2021, Helle also runs a completely different project called Archaeology in the Classroom. And this aims to integrate archaeology in the school curriculum from a very young and tender age onwards. And I would say a lot of us would like to see far more of those kind of initiatives coming up. But now back to David. David, I'm very keen to hear about your research. I'm very happy you came over from Cyprus and on your way to the UK. And I'm sort of interested in seeing and trying to understand in how far maybe your research fits with what I know from the Bronze Age and the work of Dimitris Nakassis and various other people working on professions. So it will be interesting to see if something will click there for me. The floor is yours, David. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Anne for the invitation and Demi for facilitating my being here, and to all of you for coming to listen. I'm honoured to be here, and I'm going to try to justify my inclusion on a lecture programme whose other participants are archaeologists. I'm not. Okay, I'm as I mentioned, a historian. This talk's very much a work in progress. rather than a finished and final piece. It's more show and tell than an actual argument. But I'm glad to have this opportunity to pull together several strands of work that I've done, strands of work that others have done, and strands of ongoing work that I'm supposed to be doing at the moment, but my 9-month-old son is distracting me from. And the opportunity to present this to archaeologists and see what they make of it is very useful to me. So thank you for that. So the first strand I want to mention is work done by my teacher, Edward Harris, over here, but also on the screen. There we go. Who back in 2002 published an essay entitled Workshop, Marketplace and Household, the Nature of Technical Specialization in Classical Attica and its Influence on Economy and Society. So in this essay, Edward pointed out the lopsidedness of a lot of historical work on the ancient Greek economy, which was very much focused on exchange, not so much on the organization of production, though he did acknowledge the fine work done on the Greek countryside and agriculture was pretty prominent in the 1980s and 90s. But non-agricultural production in general and crafts in particular had been pretty neglected by historians, at least for the 50 years prior. So to remedy that, Edward presented a list of around 170 occupational terms that he'd culled from extensive reading in the primary sources. He did state that his search was incomplete and his list preliminary, but it was still a revolutionary essay when it was published. And the second strand, some of my own work, so fairly random, haphazard reading in the textual sources during the 2010s, led me to find and collect some more occupational terminology. And in a volume of 2020, co-edited with Edward and with Edmund Stewart, who really spearheaded this project, entitled Skill, Labour and Professionalism in Ancient Greece and Rome. I presented an updated list based on Edward's 2002 one, but incorporating these subsequently found new terms. Here's just a kind of screenshot of a page of that, and I tried to organize them by particular kind of areas. You could organize it slightly differently, but it had to be ordered somehow or other. I spent quite a lot of that essay trying to argue, so it brought the total up to 246. Okay, but I spent quite a lot of the essay arguing that not all of those terms reflected full-time specialisms. Okay, some of them were seasonal tasks like olive picking, and others were tasks that would take a certain amount of time as part of the chaîne opératoire of production of this or that article, but not a full-time permanent job. So it would be possible if you chipped away those kinds of terms to reduce the numbers. And I reckon that realistically speaking, even if you took a fairly primitive stance, it would be hard to think of there being fewer than 160 to 180 full-time specialized roles in the Athenian economy. I should state that this is also preliminary work. I've not finished the collection of material. But I'm now returning to the issue as a part of an ERC-funded project entitled Class Study in Ancient Greek Democracy, led by my colleague in Edinburgh, Mirko Cannavaro, and in which I and my colleague Douglas Cairns are co-investigators, and this constitutes the third strand. So my role will be to lead the socioeconomic part of the project, and I intend, among other things, to complete a full sweep of the textual evidence for Classical Attica, assemble a comprehensive list of terms to do with labour, whether full-time occupations or smaller tasks, and then do some targeted deep dives on particular understudied occupations. We're also going to be hiring an archaeologist fairly soon as a postdoc, so anyone's interested or knows anyone who's interested, please watch out for the advertisement there on the classicist list. Anyway, to the topic itself, the literary sources on crafts pertaining to classical Athens are maybe best known as a source of social attitudes among a philosophically inclined subset of the elite. So most of you probably heard of the term Banausos, whose use Felix Burio has shown is concentrated mainly among three authors of the 4th century, Xenophon, Plato, and Aristotle. And for the first two, various interactions with the crafts come about through Socratic dialogues. For Socrates was a famous botherer of artisans, regularly frequenting their workshops, yet seems to have held them in some contempt. comparing them to slaves. And here I'll take the opportunity to plug shamelessly a forthcoming essay of mine in this volume, which will be out in a few months' time, which deals particularly with that. Aristotle is a bit more interesting in that urban artisans play an important role in his sociology of democracy and oligarchy in the politics. So you can see here in the politics, Aristotle breaks down the monolithic term, the demos, the kind of citizen body, into its socio-economic constituent parts. As he remarks, there are several kinds of demos. For example, of the kinds of demos, one is the farmers, another those concerned with the crafts, the kind involved in trading, which is engaged in buying and selling, and the kind concerned with the sea. Then he breaks that down further, of which part is the navy, part is engaged in wealth acquisition, so trade, part in ferrying passengers, and part in fishing. In addition to these, there are the manual laborers and those who have too little property. These subsections of the demos vary in relative proportion from city to city, and the relative size of this or that socio-economic component part of the demos has implications for the kind of democracy that results, at least according to Aristotle. So here in the second passage here, he remarks that there's, again, different kinds of demos. There's the plethos, the mass of farmers, that of vulgar craftsmen, to Banao's son, that of the laborers. And when the first of these is added to the second, and the third again to both of them, it not only affects the quality of the democracy for better or worse, it also changes its kind. Now, Aristotle sets out 4 different kinds of democracy. First kind's the best one in his eyes, and the last kind's the worst. In this third passage, he says, each particular kind of democracy corresponds to the superiority of each particular kind of the demos. Okay, so if the mass of the farmers is predominant, it will be the first kind of democracy, so the best in his 4 options. If the banaosoi and wage earners are predominant, that's the worst kind, the last kind. And similarly for the others in between these. And there are practical reasons for Aristotle preferring a democracy made up of farmers rather than craftsmen. For farmers were locked into a somewhat inflexible calendar and must plough, sow, harvest, and so on at particular times of the year. Furthermore, in large regions like Attica, many farmers lived out in demes that were inconveniently located for traipsing down to the Pnyx and voting. So a democracy where the demos is composed of farmers is the best sort in Aristotle's view, because it can claim the legitimacy of including all of the citizens in the government, when in practice most of them don't show up to exercise their rights. Leave the running of things to the educated, urban-dwelling elite. Craftsmen, on the other hand, mainly lived in the city and therefore close to the Pnyx, the courts, and so on. And for them, one labouring day looked something like the next. Certainly more flexible than farmers anyway. So a craftsman could down tools for a day and participate in government without jeopardising his business if he has something like, say, state pay for attending the assembly, which existed in the 4th century, or for attending the courts from the 5th century onwards. So, for Aristotle, craftsmen and market vendors, by the very nature and location and rhythms of their work, had a structural advantage when it came to participating in democracy that gave them an outsized influence on politics relative to their overall numbers. So for men like Aristotle, the way to hamstring radical democracy was like remove civic pay for civic duties, and then also privilege those components of the demos least likely to actually show up and exercise their rights. So you can see in the Rhetoric to Alexander, which is attributed falsely to Aristotle, but it's a 4th century text, it says, "We must guard that the laws deter the populace from plotting against those who have property." And one might organize this in this way: if, of the poor, farmers or shippers were privileged wherever those who hang about in the marketplace. So if you're a shipper, you're probably off at sea a lot. If you're a farmer, you're locked into your agricultural calendar. These agoraioi are sitting right next to the locations of politics in town. They're the ones you want to target. So this sort of textual evidence for crafts tells us more about social attitudes than practical details about artisans' lives and work. But what I'm going to be focusing on this evening is other kinds of textual evidence, especially epigraphic evidence, that can tell us about aspects of the artisanal sector of the Athenian economy, if we want to entitle it that tend not to survive in the material remains so well, and which constitutes the richest kind of evidence that Edward and I have been drawing on for evidence of specialization in the occupational lexicon. In Edward's essay, he wrote especially about horizontal and vertical specialization. So a little bit on that. At the bottom of both of these is consumer demand. So if consumer demand for such and such an item is sufficient to enable someone to specialize in its production, more or less full time, and we can debate what that means, then doing so produces two kinds of benefit. The first is an increase in volume of production, which is something that Plato noted in the Republic in his discussion of the so-called city of pigs. The second is an increase in quality, which Xenophon recognized in this passage, which is one of my favorites. So here Xenophon is describing the organization of the king of Persia's kitchen. And to make that kind of relatable to his Greek audience, he reaches for an analogy that would be familiar to them, and it's shoemaking. Okay, here's what he says: just as all other arts are developed to superior excellence in large polis, in that same way, the food at the king's palace is also elaborately prepared with superior excellence. For in small polis, the same workman makes chairs and doors and plows and tables, and often this same artisan builds houses, and even so, he is thankful if he can only find employment enough to support him. And it is, of course, impossible for a man of many trades to be proficient in all of them. In large polis, on the other hand, inasmuch as many people have demands to make upon each branch of industry, one trade alone, and very often even less than a whole trade, is enough to support a man. One man, for instance, makes shoes for men, and another for women. And there are places even where one man earns a living by only stitching shoes, another by cutting them out, another by sewing the uppers together, whilst there is another who performs none of these operations but only assembles the parts. It follows, therefore, as a matter of course, that he who devotes himself to a very highly specialized line of work is bound to do it in the best possible manner. So this passage shows both horizontal and a bit of vertical specialization. So in large cities, consumer demand is enough to enable individuals to specialize in the production of just one of those commodities that the village kind of jack of all trades has a go at doing multiple ones. So you can have potters making pots, weavers weaving garments, that kind of thing. But demand is so intense in these very large cities, and presumably Xenophon is thinking of his hometown of Athens, or maybe Corinth, where he spent some of his adult life, that the production of single commodities can be the outcome of collaboration between multiple subspecialists. How this manifested in our evidence for the terminology of so how is this manifested in our evidence for the terminology of crafts? What problems of interpretation might looking at these terms throw up? Let me give you one example: curse tablet. Here and in other slides, I'm just giving you screenshots of the Inscriptiones Graecae website and the new IG volume of the curse tablets by Jaime Cervera. So this is all online. You can look at translations in German if you want, or in English. I'll give you numerous other ones from this remarkable genre as we go through. So here the target of the curse is this chap Lysanias, the blaster he's described here, the Phusites. So he's really a bellows operator or a blower, okay. And he works in an Argyrokopion, so you could translate this as a mint, or also more broadly as a silversmith shop. If you know the famous Berlin foundry painter's name vase, basically Lysanias is the silversmithing equivalent of this guy, okay, lurking behind there with his bellows. So what's interesting here is, for me at least, is the standpoint of the writer. Did Lysanias go around calling himself a Phusites, okay, which is maybe one of the more unskilled roles in the silversmith shop? Perhaps he thought of himself in terms of the more prestigious term Argyrokopos, silversmith. But here he's identified by a nameless enemy who calls a spade a spade. Lysanias is just the fellow who operates the bellows. Yet this enemy is trying to basically summon up supernatural malign forces and direct it at this guy. So he's not going to call him something that's unrecognizable. He's pointing him in the right direction. This guy is definitely, his occupation, his livelihood is as a bellows operator. So this kind of evidence gives us insights into subspecialization within silversmithing of the sort that Xenophon's talking about in relation to shoemaking. You could look elsewhere for a different view of this. I mean, here we've got the grave stele of Sosinos of Gortins. This is a medic, a guy from Crete, who's living in Athens. We don't get a direct statement of occupational identity by the deceased, but we do get the next best thing, which is one by his children. Okay, Sosinos is described in the inscription as a chalcoptes. Okay, so a copper smelter. You can see the paraphernalia of his art here. I'm no art historian, and we have some very prestigious ones in here who can gainsay this, but I have read among art historians that this is supposed to be his bellows that he's carrying down in his hand. You can correct me on this later. But must all such terms indicate full-time specialisms? We might dwell for a moment on the issue of sidelines. So for the an earlier edited volume, this one on the ancient Greek economy from 2016 that Edward and I co-edited along with Mark Wilmer, I compiled an appendix to the volume of references to commodities in old comedy. This was actually more fun to do than it looks. Okay, so it's the 11 extant plays of Aristophanes, all his fragments and all the fragments of his contemporaries. So there's like 17 pages of this. So I'm still getting therapy for it. Anyway, so in arranging these into broad categories, I tried to match some of the terminology from the occupation list up with the products that were being produced. So you can see some examples there. Possibly the font size is too tiddly for you to see, but there's weapons at the top right. So I've got a bowyer, a sword maker, a spear maker, and then some of the items there. You see actually the items well exceed the actual specialisms that are in the occupational terms. So I think the effort was something of a failure to match those up, but it left me with the conviction that the production of a wide range of manufactured goods in Attica wasn't the full-time task of a specialist with a specialist name, but a sideline of an artisan working in some general area. So we've seen a minute ago the village kind of jack of all trades, as we call him, in Xenophon, who has to try his hand at making various things, and he's not terribly good at any of them, just to scrape a living. But in the city, demand was much greater specialization possible, but many products were just so niche that they didn't enable full-time specialism. And I've long wondered, for instance, and Helle and I were talking about this just before we started, like who made various items in this commodities list, like weasel traps and walking sticks and brooms and chopping blocks. Actually, I just come from Cyprus. My wife's Cypriot, and in the museum in Larnaca, there is a Phoenician grave stele for a walking stick maker, but I've not found a Greek equivalent of this. There's another one for a chariot maker too. Anyhow, a curse tablet from the 4th century gives us an interesting twist in this phenomenon, and here we go. Among a number of persons cursed is a chap named Kimon, a citizen from the urban deme Lykonoion, described as a syringopoios kai tekton, okay, a panpipe maker and carpenter. Rather colorfully, his pipe case and the pipes within it are cursed too. We learn the remarkable detail that Kimon would take his pipes in the pipe case to the agora at dawn. What's interesting here is that Kimon appears to be first and foremost a panpipe maker. His occupational description front loads syringopoios, okay, that's the main one, and then he's a tekton, he's a carpenter as well. And the detail about going down to the agora suggests that Kimon's normal business routine was to battle down to the marketplace at the crack of dawn with his case full of panpipes and try to sell them, which he probably didn't manage to because he got cursed, and so did his box. And anyway, the carpentry job, rather than being Kimon's main focus, appears as a kind of fallback. We might imagine that the demand for pipes alone was not enough to make ends meet, and Kimon performed odd carpentry jobs too to make a living. This is redolent of the gondoliers in Venice, whom Jan Morris described as working only 4 months a year in the gondolas and the rest of the year in restaurants. Yet they took their work identity from their more prestigious task So this is a flip side of sidelines. What could start off as a sideline, if business is good, can kind of eclipse the someone's main job and relegate it to being something like a fallback. Another valuable contribution of the textual evidence lies in filling out our knowledge of artisans who work with organic materials, which survive less well in the ground, especially in Greece. Take for example, as a counterpoint, Sanidas' extremely useful catalogue of excavated workshop remains in Attica, the Megrid, and the Peloponnese. If you look at the contents of his catalogue for Attica, which is here, I've picked out the content category things in blue. You'll see many entries for metalworking shops. What's he got there? 25 of those. Many for potteries. Well, there's stonemasons. He's got 12, and he's got 51 for potteries. Okay, but for organic remains, it's just a tiny handful. Okay, so there's a shoemaker's shop. There's the textile workshop in Baltset in the Kerameikos. Famously, some people think this is a brothel. There's a dye shop in Kerameikos, a couple of possible fooleries, but not very much. Just the numbers are much smaller. This kind of makes sense given the archaeological signature that the producing pottery or working in a mason's shop or smelting metals creates relative to these working organic materials. So how do we get it, those crafts that don't show up so well in the archaeological record? Benoit Dercy's valuable book on hides and leatherwork is described by its author as une archéologie du disparu, okay? And he remedies the relative lack of surviving organic material remains of leatherwork by looking laterally and making full and abundant use of the literary, epigraphical, and iconographic record. Similarly, Stella Spandidaki draws on the full range of sources for her study of textiles, though it is true that a handful of these have survived in funerary contexts. But for lucky chance, we might have lost entire craft specializations from our corpus of labor terms. So for instance, we would not otherwise know directly of specialized net makers in classical Athens, were it not for one 4th century curse tablet that targets 2 such artisans. Kitos, who's described as a stigmatias, so a guy who's tattooed or branded, and then a woman, Euphrosyne. I want to look at a few other epigraphic dossiers and genres, and we might take note as we go through of the question of standpoint. So who uses our occupational terminology, and why do they use it? And this is, by the subject of a recent PhD dissertation, a Chicago one by Mills MacArthur. Hopefully that will become a book in due course. So in this curse tablet, it's the enemy of Kitos and Euphrosyne, and he uses their occupations to pick them out and direct these malign supernatural forces at them. So this is actually, I think, pretty good grounds for thinking these are real. This is their main job. This is their livelihood. These are true specializations, not just kind of partial sidelines. And 2 other important epigraphical dossiers to take note of. And the first is a list of medics honored at the end of the 5th century for helping to defeat the oligarchic junta of the 30 here. And I'll give you a translation from Stephen Lambert and Co.'s splendid Attic inscriptions online. Unlike the parallel honors for citizens, which got a different inscription, and which mention them by their boring demotics, this lists the non-citizen honorants by occupation. Among them are various artisans. There's a sail stitcher, a leather worker, a sackclothier. There's a cartwright, a metal worker, a goldsmith, a spear maker, which is I think the first and only time a spear maker is mentioned in the epigraphical record of Athens. And then another guy who either makes saws or is a sawyer. Here the standpoint is that of the Athenian state, and we find specialisms that, to my knowledge, but I may be mistaken, you can correct me afterwards, have eluded the archaeology of workshop remains at least. Obviously, many of these products do survive in the material record. There's things like cartwrights, spear makers, sail stitchers. This is something where the textual evidence really gives us something extra. Another important epigraphical dossier comes from the later 4th century, the so-called Phyalae inscriptions. And these are inventories of dedications of metal Phyalae, so libation bowls, uniformly weighing 100 drachmas, on which were inscribed short texts stating that so-and-so had eluded conviction by such and such a person. So we no longer have the phylae themselves, but the inscriptions on them were copied across into the inscribed inventory, which we do have, at least substantial chunks of. Now, there's an ongoing debate over the interpretation of these documents. A long-standing orthodoxy that exists that sees them as relating to a manumission process. Elizabeth Meyer showed back in 2010 how convoluted and improbable this orthodoxy is, and suggested that the dedicants were emetics. Edward has a paper forthcoming, which may be submitted in 2025, which sets his thesis on a firmer footing. But it doesn't matter which of those is right, but it's Edward. It doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is we've got a lot of occupations mentioned in them, and we've got every reason for thinking that these are personal declarations of occupational identity. David, the ancient historian, escaped prosecution from who knows, and then that goes on the phylae. So let me show you some of these. Here you go. So we've got a goldsmith whose name's damaged. We've got a guy called Bion living in Melite, City Dean. He's a cutter of signet rings. Who else we got? We've got Ophelion. He makes clean-eye couches. Because we got these metic name formulas as well, it tells us the dean that they're resident in, so we can start to build up a spatial sense of where different occupations are being practiced across the urban landscape. It's low resolution, but it's something. Epigraphy can also throw up other standpoints that ignore occupational identities almost entirely and simultaneously raise various other questions about how niche items and services were procured. So take, for example, the incredibly rich Eleusis building accounts edited by Kevin Clinton most recently. So one of these inscriptions, I Eleusis 178, dates to the year 329-8 BC and records disbursements of money made to various workers during renovations of the sanctuary. And here we learn of the purchase of 2 jars of pitch from Pamphilos the stallholder, of leather cord from Archaeos the Samian, of baskets from Agathon and Arminius, and another guy called Sikon the Boeotian, doors from Dionysius of Eleusis. Glue for the doors was supplied by another chap named Agathon. Door studs, like metal iron studs that go into the doors, they got from a guy called Philon. There's the services of a chap named Carion were engaged for sawing wood. Door posts were sourced from the merchant Syros. I'm going to say more things on door making later. Don't get too excited. Okay. More pitch was purchased, this time from a man with the Paphlagonian name Tibeos. A lady named Thetaly was paid for supplying felt hats, like little felt hats, to the 17 public slaves engaged in the works at Eleusis. Artemas and Manes supplied sacks of chaff. They're used somehow in the building. I'm not exactly sure what role they played. Antigenes the Megarian supplied cloaks for the public slaves. Attas the merchant, leather aprons. Apollophanes supplied their shoes. Menon, a metic living in Kolytos, fashioned keys for the sanctuary gates. Kephalion supplied ladders. Syros, a metic living in Alopeke, was paid to whitewash the altar. Pamphilos, a metic living in Piraeus, made a pair of hinge posts for the doors of the treasury. Agathon supplied glue made from bull's hooves. And a chap named Solon was paid for plastering and pitch daubing the Eleusinian. So one interesting feature of this document for our purposes is that occupational terms are used sparingly. Pamphilos is called a skenites, a stallholder. A couple of other guys are called emperoi, merchants. But beyond that, we just get names and what they were paid for supplying goods or services. The standpoint here is basically an accounting one, showing accountability. The text is meant to set out the run of expenditure from Brittany to Brittany throughout the year with minimal elaboration. Some of the words are actually abbreviated. It's quite compressed. So occupational identities are not really being projected here. But such documents nonetheless shed startling light on the practicalities of major building works and preserve precious details of the names of the artisans whose skills and products were called on. Another inscription in the Eleusis dossier sheds light on the issue of repairing and sharpening tools, for it records payments to Hephaestion, a metic living at Eleusis, for sharpening the tools used by the public slaves. In another inscription from the Eleusis accounts, there's a metic named Manes, an Anatolian name, who lived up Pendeli, and he's paid 1 obol for every 3 drills that he sharpens for the masons working and the quarry workers quarrying stone for the sanctuary. So on the subject of repairs, archaeology has furnished us with much evidence for ancient repairs to pottery. Textual sources add something else to our knowledge. Consider this cursed tablet from the Kerameikos, where 2 of the targets, Demetrios and Demades, are described using the word keramodetos, which Jaime Corbera translates as pot repairer. The term is found only in this document. It isn't in LSJ. It's spelt differently the 2 times it's used. I haven't got the second spelling on. It's cut off at the bottom, sorry. But basically, it combines the word for pot, keramos, with a nominal derivative of the verb to bind, deo. So it's a pot binder. There's an entry in the Attic stelae. These are the inscriptions recording confiscated and sold property of the Herm bashers from the time of the Sicilian expedition in the 410s. There's an entry there for a storage vase, a large one confiscated from its owner, flogged off by the Athenian state, called a fidachne, and it's described as dedimeni, okay, bound, a participle of that same verb deo, which Amix has argued refers to a repaired pot. So keramodetos is another new occupation to add to our list, okay? And again, it's interesting to see that someone could be described as a pot repairer as a general occupational identity, and doubly interesting to see 2 of these guys mentioned in one document where they're working together as colleagues. That seems a better explanation to me than that 2 practitioners of this fairly niche trade were just randomly mentioned in the same document and nowhere else ever. And sometimes textual sources like cursed tablets subvert the generalizations that would be familiar from more famous literary sources. So take, for example, Xenophon's Economicus, which makes quite a strong gender division between women working within the house and men working out with the house in the fields and so on, and that they don't collaborate, essentially they're separate spheres. But a cursed tablet from the 4th century, another one, okay, this one, binds down Dionysius the helmet maker and his wife Artemis the Chrysotria, translated here as gold worker, but more specifically meaning a gilder. Could we have here a single workshop with Dionysius producing the helmets and Artemis gilding them to make them extra appealing? Even if not, it's interesting to see a woman engaged in a metalworking task. Text can also tell us something about the quality of social relations within workshops, none so much as this lead letter published by David Jordan back in 2000. It reads, Lysis is sending a letter to Xenocles and his mother, asking that they by no means overlook that he is perishing in the foundry, but they come to his masters and they have something better found for him. For I have been handed over to a thoroughly wicked man. I'm perishing from being whipped. I'm tied up. I'm treated like dirt more and more. As Edward again pointed out in an essay of 2004, the mention of the word despotas, masters in the accusative, plural, shows that Lysis was a slave with more than one owner. We know about this from literary sources too. So this was a thing. This text constitutes maybe a salutary warning not to romanticize ancient crafts in a kind of William Morris-esque manner, for often workshops were manned by slaves, and these might be treated dreadfully, like poor Lysis here. So I've shown you a fair few epigraphical texts so far, and I want to move towards a conclusion by returning to the literary sources, and in particular 2 authors who, in my opinion, have not been mined enough for evidence of the history of labour in general and crafts in particular. They're very different authors, Julius Pollux and Theophrastus. So Pollux is Onomasticon, especially book 7, and that book's devoted particularly to occupational terminology and the terminology of products produced by artisans. It's an important but difficult and somewhat neglected text. It's been aptly described as a word hoard. It was essentially a compilation of mainly Attic, classical Attic words for all manner of things, many of them defunct in everyday Greek of Pollux's day. Pollux's day was the time of the Emperor Commodus. And they're culled from Pollux's very wide reading of the full range of available classical Athenian literature, far more extensive than what survives today. Given the Atticist mania of that period, the so-called Second Sophistic, having a compendium of good classical Attic words at hand was no doubt useful for those members of the intelligentsia who wished to lace their sentences with obscure but learned words and phrases. Anyhow, what we have today is a Byzantine epitome or abridgment of the original, but it remains a treasure trove of technical terminology and not that much used by labour historians these days. We might call the onomasticon more of a word heap than a word hoard. And take a very typical entry from Book 7, which I've tried to render into intelligible English. Okay. Felter, good for felting, felt making, felting, for felting, felt, made of felt, felt. To be like felted items for the body in Plato's Timaeus. To felt was a verb, okay. To felt together, compressing felt. And then I had to make up some English words which don't actually exist. Felties, feltikins for some diminutives. And not only is what is placed on the head called pilos, felt, but also that worn around the feet is Crotinus, this is a poet of old comedy, makes clear in his Wimps, saying, having white felt shoes on his feet. And Plato in his Symposium also adds fleece to felt shoes, quote, muffled up our feet in felt shoes and fleece. Pollux basically presents us with a pile of words, practically a stack of index cards, then written out as a paragraph. This is completely typical of the entire work, which is impossible to read from cover to cover. It's just, well, you can try. But note at the start of the entry, this word pilopoios, okay, a felter, a word that survives in only one other place in ancient Greek literature. Book 1 of Pollux's Onomasticon. Okay, I found 2 inscriptions from the Roman period that have it, but nothing earlier. Although, as we can see from this passage, Pollux does sometimes name check his sources, so Crotinus and Plato, Plato twice actually. Most of the time he doesn't, and we don't know exactly where in classical Attic literature Pollux found the word for a felter. But as I noted earlier, such specialists really did exist. So you might remember the woman Thetaly, who sold those felt hats to the Athenian state to kit out the public slaves, the 17 public slaves at Eleusis. Much remains to be done in this text. It'll become much more accessible in the next few years when my colleague Naomi Scott of the University of Bristol gets up and running a crowdsourced translation of the whole thing. I think it would be impossible to find someone who would agree to translate the whole thing from start to finish. There's not enough money in the world to pay someone to do that. Anyway, whereas Pollux gives us a wide range of words covering the whole artisanal sector, but little granular detail about how particular occupations worked in practice, we can find some remarkable material of the latter sort in the writings of Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor at the Lyceum. Some of his works have been well used by economic historians. I'm thinking here of his treatise on odors that has been used by scholars like Gary Rieger, Natasha Massar, and Giuseppe Squillace to study perfume production. But the Historia Plantarum remains more or less virgin territory for the economic historian. So I've got an unfinished paper on market gardening that I need to find an archaeobotanist to collaborate with, or will never get finished. But since I'm talking about crafts today, I'm going to show you some passages from Book 5, which is on wood, and to do with the production of doors. So here we go, I'll just read you these. The wood of the elm is the least likely to warp, wherefore they make the hinges of doors out of elm wood. For if these hold, the doors also keep in place, otherwise they get wrenched out of place. They make the hinges by putting wood from the root above and wood from the top of the tree, okay, the foliage below, thus reversing the natural position by wood from the foliage. Joiners, tectones, mean the upper wood. For when these are fitted the one into the other, each counteracts the other as they naturally tend in opposite directions. Whereas if the wood were set as it grows, all the parts would give where the strain came. This use of elm for doors, by the way, is fully corroborated in the Eleusis building accounts, which mentions elm sourced in the Piraeus and then actually shipped on the coast from Piraeus to the little harbour at Eleusis and then used for making the doors of the sanctuary. He goes on, carpenters say that all woods have a core, but that it is most plainly seen in the silver fir, in which one can detect a sort of bark-like character in the rings. In olive, box, and such woods, this is not so obvious. Wherefore, they say that box and olive lack this tendency, for that these woods are less apt to draw than any others. Drawing is the closing in of the wood as the core is disturbed. For since the core remains alive, it appears for a long time. It is always removed from any article, whatever is made of this wood, but especially from doors, so that they may not warp. That's why the wood is split. He goes on, the wood of the nettle tree and other kinds which are used for making pivots for doors is smeared with cow dung to prevent their splitting, the object being that the moisture due to the core may be gradually dried up and evaporated. And however, green wood is easier to work with the axe and the chisel or the plane, for the chisel gets a better hold and does not slip off. Again, softer woods are easier for the axe and for smoothing, and also a better polished surface is obtained. The cornelian cherry is also a very strong wood, and among the rest, elm wood is the strongest, wherefore, as was said, they make hinges for doors of elm wood. Manna, ash, and beech have very moist wood, and for off these they make elastic bedsteads. Theophrastus appears to have continued the tradition of artisan bothering that his intellectual great-grandfather Socrates pursued, but unlike Socrates, he wrote down what he found out, and that gives us some remarkably granular insights into the doormaker's craft. However, you might note that Theophrastus just uses a general term, tekton, carpenter, when he's talking about door making. However, in the tradition of old comedy, nicknaming prominent Athenians after the source of their wealth, we know that an older contemporary of Aristophanes, Aristomenes, was nicknamed the Theropoios, the door maker. Naturally, the term turns up in Pollux's Onomasticon. His family presumably owned a carpentry shop that specialized in door making, and it was a ubiquitous product. For every house needed a door. Some were plain and cheap, others beautifully made and ornate. And we can get a sense of the latter from vase paintings. In this Pyxis, for example, with a meeting at the door of Iphigenia and Danae, or in this bell crater, which shows what the Americans call, and here's my tie-in to the Netherlands Institute, a Dutch door, okay? One that was indeed popular in the early modern Netherlands, as this painting by Samuel van Hoogstraat illustrates. Naturally, Pollux has a term for this, a thera diapristos, okay, a sawn-through door. So with that, I'll draw to a close. I look forward to the response and discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. That was amazing. I've written down so much. I think I can sort of maybe I should put on the microphone before I actually start speaking.
You can share mine.
I think I'm supposed to use this one. Is it working? Yes, I think so, right? Okay. So thank you. That was amazing. I didn't stop writing for a second there. So fantastic. I think without further ado, we're going to open the floor up to questions because I'm sure there will be a ton. So if you have a question, I will come over with this microphone that you can then speak into. Yes.
You had an example for the wooden doors. Do you have any for the softer wood that had dung smeared on it, or is that just something we assume happened?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to dig more properly into the Eleusis building records because as far as I'm aware, that has the most detailed stuff on doors. So I'll do that and I can send you an email. But I don't know for the moment. You got to wonder though, like how some guy working in a carpenter's shop in the city like sources his cow dung. He's probably got a guy, you know.
And there's probably a name for that too.
Yeah, coprologos. Yeah.
How are there so many cursed tablets preserved?
That's a good question. So these are mostly written on scraps of lead. This is a byproduct of silver mining. And they get thrown down wells and things like that. I think that's often kind of a common archaeological context, or they can be pushed into corners and things here and there. So there've been quite a few of them found in the Kerameikos and then also in the Agora. There's also other contexts. The Karinia ship has one nailed to it. So there's various archaeological contexts for that, but there'll be other people in the room that know much better than me and who probably have excavated some of these. They're particular find spots.
I have another question about doors. Was it common for like normal households to have doors, or was it just for like temples, or were there specific types of doors for specific houses, or?
I think it's a normal thing for houses. Temples have really nice doors. They often use cypress wood, which is sometimes imported from Crete. We've got a number of references for that. And I think, I mean, I'm not, as I say, not an art historian, and there's some people who are really top art historians in the room who can say more. But it would seem that, you know, certain maybe higher status people had nicer doors. There's some random references in Pollux to particular fittings that you get for doors made out of metal. So, and there was that reference I mentioned earlier to the guys providing kind of studs. I mean, that's possibly what's depicted in this Dutch door here, metal studs. So it kind of, I'm presuming, differs according to social status, and then the temples get the absolutely the best ones.
If I can just chip in on doors, it's in one of Foxhall's publications, but I don't remember which one, where it's actually said that when people move house, they take the doors and windows with them, including also the roof tiles. So now I can understand why.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's the really famous passage in Thucydides, and it's the outbreak of war. Basically, Archidamus brings his Spartan army into Attica, and the Athenians, whom Thucydides says most of them at that point lived in the countryside, they're taking their doors and their fittings out of their mud brick houses and taking them with them into the city because they're that valuable. Because building timber is not in great supply in Attica. There's we know that there's kind of managed woodland that people use for making charcoal and also for firewood and things like that. But typically a lot of this wood for construction is imported, sometimes from Evia, sometimes from Crete, sometimes from other places. And shipbuilding timber, there's nothing of that basically in Attica, so that's imported from various places too.
Oh, I do. Oh, okay, great. David, thank you very much for this. I must say, when I first published on this, just over 20 years ago, I really didn't realize what amazing amount of material there is. And it's wonderful to see in the period after that, actually, that people have developed this. And I must say, when I first showed the list of people, what people would do, and usually the scholar's nightmare is for someone to come up and say, oh, but you missed this source, or you missed this source. And people started doing that after I showed the article in the next 5 years. But actually, in this case, when they said, you missed this one, it was great because it actually just kind of supported what I was doing. But it was always good. I remember Nancy Lukidis immediately said, oh, you missed chloroplasts. And she was absolutely right. And it is amazing, I mean, that you've gone back to this and found even more. The one thing I do want to add is, well, you're absolutely right about Pollux. But actually, Douglas Olson has translated all of it.
Has he?
Yeah, and he's just about, because the thing is, I'm working with the last week and a half, I've been working with book 8, the neighboring book. And I want to go look, actually, at book 7, but he's got a complete translation.
Wow.
The problem is, Pollux is the most infuriating author in the world to deal with, because I'm dealing with the things that have to do with the courts. And a lot of the information is very good. We don't have it elsewhere. Sometimes you cite sources which have been lost. Like, for instance, before the Aristotle's Paul was discovered, there's a lot of it in there. But unfortunately, a lot of the information is also just wrong. And so the thing is, it's a rich source. You're absolutely right. But it's also a source that has to be, you have to read absolutely every single word.
Another problem with it is he goes beyond pure Atticism and also brings in some words from other dialects and even ones from other times. So you can't be 100% sure that you've got a word that is definitely a classical Athenian one. The probability is that it's a classical Athenian one, but you can't be 100% sure. So in terms of methodological study of using Pollux as a source for economic history, I don't really know of anything written. So that's work to be done.
David, I have a question in relation also to the paper you mentioned earlier on which some of your methodology is based. In there, you have a total or a number of professions that you want to reduce because of a variety of overlaps or general terms and so on. And one of the criteria is that the profession needs to be executed full-time in order to create a living, let's say.
Yeah.
My question is, if you have these professions, as you mentioned, the Venetian gondolier, but I think also the pipe maker fall in the same category, whereby a job is executed for a couple of months a year by a specialist in that field, and in order to top up the salary or his income, he needs to execute for more months another job, like working in a restaurant or doing some less high-status job. In how far is that a social issue when you start calling somebody not a pipe maker or a Venetian gondolier, but a waiter in a restaurant or somebody else? I can imagine that economically it doesn't really matter, but socially in society that may have some serious consequences one way or another.
I absolutely agree. This PhD by Mills MacArthur addresses that somewhat. Then there's, when I do this, complete this collection, I'm not going to just keep things in that I think are full-time jobs. That I'm put in everything, and then people can make their own minds up. And partly the reason I was doing that and trying to get a number is because of the implications for the wider debate about the level of complexity in the economy. And kind of goes back to that old primitivist modernist debate from the 1890s onwards. But also to compare with other times and places. We've got, for example, like tax records from medieval Paris that will list a certain number of occupations, specialisms, and if you're using rough, like a stricter standard of a strict standard for calling something an occupation, then you can't be accused of like over-interpreting your evidence. If you have a quite conservative view, then you can hold it up to the other times and places and say, actually, even on a minimalist view, this is more sophisticated than such and such a medieval time, so on and so forth. So there's a kind of rationale behind my doing that, but you could take the whole list and look at it a completely different way. So I don't insist on it. It was just for a kind of fairly immediate purpose, but I'll include everything, and then people completely disagree with me, but have the material there and collected.
Yeah, thanks very much.
David, I've got a few questions here from the online attendance. This one is from Pedro Fabier, who says it is a pleasure, first of all, and asks, can we see in the text or inscriptions a different specialization and division of labor depending on whether the work was done in private workshops in the city or in the public context in the city or in sanctuaries?
So I mean, there are occupations. There are jobs that are essentially state jobs that are salaried for particular reasons. So there's a kind of division there. That certain jobs are done for the state, but you can have an intermediary situation like in the Eleusis accounts where you've got people who are, like Thetaly the felt maker. She just makes felt hats. Maybe she makes felt shoes as well. I don't know. She sells them, and then at some point someone comes to her and says, can you do a job for us? We need 17 of these for the state. She sells them, then she goes back to working in her private business. So in terms of what's done for the state, it would be the magistracies on the one hand, and then a kind of private sector being called on for various things that you don't want to employ someone full time for. But I can't think of anything. I mean, one job that there isn't a private sector for is the state executioner, who's a public owned slave. Okay, so that's one example of a specialization where.
I'm not sure that qualifies as production though.
Oh, it's destruction. Yeah, production of justice. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not judging.
Right.
There's probably other ones that aren't occurring to me right now. But.
Right. Then we have a question from Selene Thomas. What about jewelry? Is there some interesting material? There is a exhibition in the Menarche at the moment from Kos. She says, is there any references to jewelry making and the like? Yeah,
we've got references to goldsmiths, like chrysochos is a general term. There's gem cutters as well. We've got references to. There's actually in the Attic stelae, it's quite interesting. These confiscation records from the late 5th century. You've got 45 slaves, and they're auctioned off by the state for different amounts of money depending on their market value. The most valuable guy is a Carian goldsmith. So you can see his craft skills actually translate into his actual market price. And then the least valuable is a Carian infant, a little kiddie who's got no craft skills at all, and there's probably a bit of a liability. But it's in terms of child labour, my colleague at Edinburgh, Ulrika Roth, has been doing some comparative work because she works on child slavery in the Roman Empire, and it's pretty disturbing stuff. So these from modern ethnographic studies can be shown that children could become actually not an economic burden but an asset from about age 5 in textile production. So there you go.
Sorry.
So that sort of took a dark turn there.
More questions.
Thanks, David. This is really interesting. My question is, from the evidence that you know about, is there any way to say anything, let me say, sort of quantitative about economic life? And what I'm thinking is, can you go from like the number of references to a certain profession that, oh, this had a larger role in the economy than this, and then the other way I mean is sort of any kind of chronological change. Like, you know, nowadays we don't have wheelwrights, we don't have typists, even though 50 years ago there would be huge bodies of typists at offices. Is there enough chronology in your material to say, oh, look, we have this, you know, maybe the epigraphic habit increased, and so we have more references to inscription cutters or something like that. Anything along those lines? Thanks.
Yes, to both questions. So for the first one, there's a chap working on this in Stanford. He's a PhD student called Nick Gardner. He has a background in statistics, and he's looking at inscriptions like the Helle inscriptions, where you've got, you know, over 100 occupations attested, but you get repetitions, especially things like shoemakers that crop up quite often. And using his stats background, he's trying to work out, you know, things like, you know, the size of the sector just from the repetitions. You do get it in Phil Saperstein's done stuff for the ceramic production using ethnographic parallels to work out you know, how many people were working in fine pottery in the 460s or something like that. You can come up with reasonable estimates there. So that's to your first question. To the second one, potentially yes. I don't know enough about the Bronze Age material, and does, but there's certainly certainly kind of occupational lexicon in Linear B with some continuities, but I'm sure other things. And then there's papyrological evidence, and then there's also Latin epigraphy from Rome that Sandra Joshua wrote a book on. So you could look at all of those and compare them. Again, you'd have to finesse it by working out, you know, working through methodological questions like epigraphic habits and what's likely to be missing, and, you know, are we comparing apples and oranges? But there's potential for both of those.
I think one of the problems will also be the contextual situation. I mean, if you always look in big urban context, then you can do a certain comparison. But I doubt if over such long periods of time we'll be able to compare again something like Martini with Athens or something like that. So, yeah.
Sorry to jump in again. Those are really excellent questions. And it's interesting. There was a very good paper, a panel that David and I had in San Francisco for the Society of Classical Studies in 2016. And Graham Oliver had a very interesting paper. It was based on there was a very interesting study that was done about piano tuners in Chicago. And this person basically figured out, without knowing the exact number, like how many pianos there were, how often they needed to be tuned, and how many piano tuners there should be in Chicago. Evidently, he did all these calculations, and his calculation he did on the basis of certain assumptions came out to be almost completely on the money. Huh. And what Graham did was he tried to do the same thing for people wearing shoes in Attica. Yeah. And he still hasn't published the paper, never mind.
Yeah, and that was based on the Eleusis account.
It was based on the same kind of methodology, but he actually came up, since the sector, something what we do know is we know, for instance, triremes. Triremes, there were about 360, I think, in the middle of the 4th century. And we know each one of them has to have a tectone. That is a carpenter. So there gives you kind of, again, immediately there, gives you 360 carpenters at the time. One other thing is that recently Sylvain Fachard and Alain Bresson did, is that everybody's kind of, thought that most people should be, farmers. But actually, Bresson, based on work by Fachard actually looked at the arable land in Attica. Not all land in Attica is arable. Then figured out how many people it would have taken to actually to work the land. And there's not that much land, and it wouldn't to work all the land in Attica would not require that much of the population. So what's the rest of the population doing? They're obviously working in crafts. And I actually threw out a number for it that 50% of the adults, basically in Attica, were working in non-agricultural labor. If Sylvia's calculations are correct, that actually more or less has been confirmed, but no more work needs to be done.
I think even if the craft sector is massively outnumbered by the farmers, the structural advantages that Aristotle really focuses on give them this. Like, if you think of how many people you're going to get on the Pnyx in an assembly meeting, 6,000 on a good day. That's, it doesn't matter if there's a lot more farmers and a lot fewer artisans altogether. The fact that they mostly live in the town, they're next to it, gives them this advantage in political advantage that the farmers don't have.
Thank you very much, David. This is really a very, very impressive material, and it shows us, I'm sure that modern languages will not have all these words for these specialities. Many modern languages will not have such a rich vocabulary for these very, very specific crafts. And I think that means something we need to think about. But my question is different. I don't know whether the material you have looked at, the texts, give you any information about the gender of the people. So do you have information about to what % women could be participating in crafts?
Yeah.
And whether they could specialize in certain crafts or not specialize in certain crafts?
Yes.
Do you have any?
Yes.
There's
definitely plenty of scope for that. So for the curse tablets, for example, you get names where the gender's basically obvious there. The Fiali inscriptions, again, names, participles in the feminine if the name's damaged. So we could build up a lot of information on that. And I had a student who wrote an essay, and she went through the curse tablets. She wasn't looking at crafts in particular, but workers in general. There's a lot of women working in kind of wine taverns and so on like that. But she showed that there's actually a lot of, like it's like half the people mentioned in these curse tablets are women workers. That throws up methodological problems again. I mean, are we looking at a snapshot of reality? Does misogyny actually skew the figures? Something like that. Are more women being cursed than men? I don't know. But there's a lot of the material I'm looking at. Gender is very obvious, so you could definitely do a lot of work on that. There's a lot of potential there.
First, thank you so much, and sorry for the accent, but thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question, my point is that I was really impressed by the discrepancy we can have between the declarative identity or declarative skills that are mentioned by people as a professional activity and the materiality of it. And you mentioned this book of the late 15th century in Paris, and I know personally one of the archaeologists who actually dug one of the part of the cities where supposedly many bronze or copper alloy related workers would at work, and there are plenty of occupation mentioned in this book related with copper alloy work, and I only found what he told me that for them it was bronzesmiths everywhere because they couldn't find the different specialties that are mentioned in the book. And I would say that we have the same issue. You have plenty of very specific and great specialties. We would have a lot of difficulties to find and to characterize materially through the excavation of the workshop or through the excavation of a tomb in some cases, for instance. And I wonder, my question, if it is related with the construction of identity. So this broad identity, we as archaeologists, or at least as archaeologists, I could attribute to someone would be kind of an ethic identity, which would also reflect maybe perception of some person of the occupation. I hope I'm making myself clear. So the discrepancy between an ethic identity and an endemic identity of someone who built his own identity by emphasizing the skills and know he consider more specific about his occupation. Like if I will stress that I am an archaeologist of the Mediterranean and Iron Age, but for someone on the street, I will be someone dealing with humanities. You know, so.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in the paper that I referred to earlier, there's my colleague Ben Russell gave me a good parallel. There's I think a term like faber ocularius, guy who makes the eyes that go into statues. No one thinks that's a full-time job, but someone had to do it, and it's a highly skilled one to produce the glass and make a really good eye that just doesn't look googly and weird. So someone's projecting that identity as like a tip-top thing. So that's absolutely, I agree, and it's one of the methodological problems. I think your question also throws up a glaring need for collaboration, with archaeologists from my point of view. As I say, we'll hire one for this project, but there's just so much work to do. This needs to be kind of something bigger. But for the moment, I'll keep on collecting my terms, and hopefully people will want to join with me and ask awkward questions and add in new information that I've overlooked.
You know we will, right? We have some more questions. One from Marion Meyer. Hi Marion. Have you got any evidence for textile production outside the house? So, and she emphatically does not want to discuss building Z in the
Yeah, me too.
I think there are some references to buying dresses.
Yeah, there's
Aristophanes.
There's a good reference in Theophrastus' characters to second-hand clothing, so it's sale. There's a reference in the Aristophanes' Frogs to a woman who spins yarn at home, but then goes down to the Agora at daybreak and sells it. So, but for the actual production, making of textiles outside of the home, can't think of anything other than those girls making the peplos sail for the boat that goes, in the Panathenaic procession. I think a lot of the time we're assuming that it's happening in the household. We don't have specific information saying that. So, whereas Stella Spantidaki when you need her.
Yes, but I think there is some evidence actually for the purchasing of textiles outside of the house.
There's, now I think about it, there's two references coming to mind. One is Aeschines 197, which mentions the inheritance of Timarchus, and he owns he inherited at least a workshop full of slave shoemakers, but there's also a woman who works in pattern weaving, and I think a man also skilled in textiles. There's another reference in Xenophon's Memorabilia to several rich Athenians who own workshops producing certain types of cloaks and garments, which seems to be a kind of, you know, not domestic production.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. And then there was, of course, your net maker in the
yeah, there's the net maker as well,
which probably is.
I mean, domestic production can be for market, and then also, I mean, I'm thinking of kind of piecework in Western cities in the 19th century. You know, a lot of textile production is kind of distributed among people, you know, women working at home making small pieces that were then sold on for larger things, lace and things like that. So it'd be difficult to use just a domestic environment to say whether it's kind of production only for the household use or for the market or anything like that.
No, there's actually a source describing textile production woolwork in the north of England in the pre-industrial phase, so in the 18th century, that describes that farmers who had sheep would weave and spin in the winter when they had time left over and for sale. And during the summer, obviously they weren't doing that. And so it was the men who would do the weaving and the women who would do the spinning for that.
Yeah, there's on this gender issue, there's a quite good paper by Lynn Foxhall in I think it's the Josina Block Festschrift that came out a couple of years ago, maybe a year ago. She makes a pretty strong case that the textile industry is pretty heavily dominated by women, even though there were a few male textile workers. And she pushes back against maybe Peter Acton and some other people who've, Wesley Thompson, who've emphasized the male workers more.
Yeah, so I'm afraid this has to be the last question, unless the answer is very short and we squeeze a very last one. This is from Bella Kamens. How frequently are you coming across terms that are not represented in major dictionaries? So basically, how often are you disagreeing with definitions of terms in, for example, LSJ? And how do you go about defining new specific occupational terms through word compounds, compare materials, or something else? And are there any dictionaries you find more accurate than others for labor and craft terminology?
That's a really good point. You know, that's a really good question. Sometimes when you get these like single things, so like sometimes you get incomplete words that are in the epigraphical sources. So we saw like a guy who, there's a word for saw somewhere in there, but we don't know if he's a saw maker or sawyer. In terms of like LSJ, is often a little bit outdated. Sometimes like Stella Spantidaki's book on textile production is really good on this because she's done on, you know, work on all the different genres of evidence and updates. So she says like LSJ translates such and such a word as embroidery. That's not what it was. It's pattern weaving. So we can get the kind of feedback kind of effect from archaeologists working on these things and helping to kind of fine tune and calibrate some of the kind of lexical work that was done 200 years ago. So, but other times it's a guessing game. Yeah.
Super. Last question.
I wanted to ask about the helmet maker and his wife,
Yeah.
Goldsmith. So you posit that instead of being a goldsmith, she was a gilder for her husband's workshop.
Mm.
Was it more common then for women who also had a job who worked with their husband, or would it also be likely that she could have worked somewhere else?
I don't know. Could be either. The material really resists making generalizations because ones where you get these kind of men and women in together are just so occasional that you can't really generalize from that. We just don't have the evidence there. But I keep both possibilities open. I think it would be unreasonable to really
Thank you very
opt for
much.
one.
Thank you for your questions.
Mm.